Hello, everyone. Mike Kenny from Voice of Sen. I've got Amy Schoenhoff here from Mindfulness in the Heartland. And this is part of our Wednesday webinar series. This is Mindful Parenting. So I know all of you mindful parents out there are here to get mentorship from Amy, as am I. I'm going to be listening earnestly, as my kids are in the other room screaming at their video games, making all sorts of raucous noise. So I need all the techniques that I can get so as to not, want to unplug their video games and do something rash. So anyway, we've got a variety of people here. Glad you're all here. I'm sure you're all going to get tons out of it. And for those that have stuck with us and have availed themselves of what Amy's done for us up to this point, I think we're just going to continue in that vein and continue to get some great information. So with that, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to change presenters to Amy, and she'll take it away. But before that, just really fast, is everyone good? Everyone ready? So we've got Amanda, Christy, of course, Greg, JD, and Matt. So we ready to go?
All right.
Go.
Well, all right. Thank you all for being here this evening. And I want to point to that there are notes. There's just basically a PDF of this evening's presentation. So you can take this with you. If you want to take notes while I talk, that's fine. Yeah, so we'll just roll along. So first thing I'm gonna do is turn my camera off, because you really don't need to see my mug while I do this.
Well, if you're gonna turn your camera off, I'm turning mine off, because if we're not watching you, hey, we're not gonna look at me, as I'm. So.
All right, I'm turning my camera off. You do what you want, Mike. And then we'll switch into the PowerPoint. Okay.
Okay. Easy enough.
If it will let me. Okay, it's not letting me do that. Can you see my screen yet, Mike?
Yes, I can.
Okay, there, now I can turn it off. Okay, so I'm gonna move into presentation mode. Maybe, there we go. All right, so let's begin this journey of mindful parenting. Hold on. All right. So let's begin first by defining what mindful parenting is. And in general, a general definition for mindfulness is paying attention, like we were just talking about mindfulness in general. It's, paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and with an attitude of non-judgment. But how that gets modified when we're talking about mindful parenting is that it's not just about being mindful ourselves in terms of what's happening for ourselves moment to moment, but it's also about being in relationship. So there's this relational quality that we are bringing into our mindfulness in terms of noticing, bringing awareness into this engagement that we have with our children, as well as this quality of this non-judgmental acceptance. So a definition that I've kind of cultivated for mindful parenting is mindful parenting means living with a greater awareness of our moment-to-moment experience while cultivating a non-judgmental acceptance of ourselves and our children. So there's the being in the present moment, this cultivation of acceptance or openness to our experience, and then this relational quality of being in relationship to our children and bringing this awareness that we're cultivating into this interpersonal relationship, because that's really what our parent-child relationship is. It's an interpersonal relationship, and for our children, it's one of the most important relationships that they'll ever have. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So just as true with mindfulness in general, the kind of pillars that all of this rests upon is intention, attention, and attitude. And we've talked about this in some of the other webinars, but I'll just touch on them and try to be a little more specific to mindful parenting as I talk about these qualities of intention, attention, and attitude. So with regard to mindful parenting, when we're talking about intention, we're, talking about like what's motivating us. Intention has to do with being purposeful, being aware of what's motivating us in the present moment. And with regard to our parenting, it's really about being connected to our heartfulness, really connected to understanding and knowing how we want to be in relationship to our children. So it's really thinking about what I want this relationship to look like. What are the values that I want to bring into my parenting? How do I want this relationship to look in terms of how I am behaving? How do I want my child to feel about themselves? What are the things that I'm trying to foster and cultivate in this human being? And how do I want that child to feel about me? What's the quality of relationship that I want to bring to this dynamic between myself and my child? So having some reflection on these things, taking the time to really know how we want to be in the relationship, how we want to show up both for our children and ourselves, and the quality of the relationship between the two people in that relationship, because each child, you're having a relationship with each child. This is a very interpersonal relationship with each child that you have. So there are dynamics that are specific to that relationship, but we're bringing similar intentions and values in terms of how we want to be in those relationships, how we want to be seen, how we want the people we're in relationship to feel in our relationship. And we're allowing that to inform us moment by moment. And it's not about, bringing guilt or shame into when we fall short. It's having a map to follow, a way to be, a path to walk, okay? And so we're walking a path, and having a sense of our intentions keeps us on that path and brings us back to that path when we get diverted, okay? And in the case of the pillar of attention, we're not only talking about a quantity of time, but also the quality of time that we're giving to the relationship. We can establish time in our family to be with our children individually and collectively as a family, but if we're checked out during that time, what is the value of the quantity of time that we're giving? So it's really about bringing a quality as well as a quantity of attention to this relationship. Because at the end of the day, what we pay attention to grows. I've often heard of this idea that attention is really a form of love. So are we placing kind, thoughtful attention on these relationships that we're having with our children, or are we just kind of, walking through parenting through our habits and kind of learned behavior that we've inherited from our parents or other caretakers that we've had in our life? How present are we? Fully present are we to our engagements with our children? And then finally, the attitude that we're bringing to this experience of parenting. And that has to do with this idea of non-judgmental acceptance. So we're really trying to cultivate and foster a certain way of relating to our children and ourselves. I mean, it's not just about them, it's about ourselves as well. And that's bringing kind of a more open and receptive approach to whatever's happening, bringing qualities like compassion and empathy into the dynamics of the relationship, as well as recognizing the sovereignty of our children. So really embracing the knowing that our children are not mini me's. Our children have their own life paths. They're born into a particular time and place and environment. They have certain likes and dislikes, and their path may look very different than ours, or what we would necessarily choose for them But recognizing when we're talking about mindful parenting is we're honoring their sovereignty. We're honoring their unique contribution to this world. And how I like to talk about it is this idea that as parents, we are kind of like gardeners tending to a garden, you know, and we're teaching our children how to tend to their own garden. So you might think of each one of your children as a flower, and they may be different types of flowers in your garden. And so what we're trying to really touch into as we kind of learn about our children and develop a relationship with them is really understanding, what does this child need? You know, rather than being like a piece of clay that we're molding, what we're trying to do is create an environment that fosters their growth and unfolding. Okay, so rather than trying to frame our children to fit into some kind of mold that we're trying to produce, instead we're really surveying the landscape that we have for them, that we've provided for them, and trying to figure out what are the best conditions for this child. And that's going to be different for each child because we're dealing with a unique temperament. We're dealing with unique interests. We're dealing with unique dynamics. So this idea of sovereignty is this idea of recognizing the uniqueness, the individuality of each child, and cultivating that so that we're providing as best we can a proper environment for them to flourish and grow, to be the person that they want to be rather than the person that we think they should be. And that can be challenging, right? Because we have our ideas and we hold very fast to our ideas about how our children should be. But in the realm of mindful parenting, we're really trying to give our children space to evolve and be who they are rather than what we want them to be. And that can be really hard. But we're bringing into that as well this idea, you know, working on these attitudes of acceptance and compassion and empathy as well, both for them and for ourselves. So why is mindfulness important to parenting? You know, why would we want to bring this quality of mindfulness into the process of parenting? And I will say in general, when we talk about mindfulness and the research that's been done on mindfulness in terms of, you know, people practicing mindfulness and learning these skills and the empirical data, you know, there is some suggestion that mindfulness can help us kind of manage the ability to adapt and have greater empathy and compassion. It can enhance our own well-being as we kind of go through this process of parenting that can be really stressful, and it can help us deal with that stress. And there are lots of ways that mindfulness in general that can help us as human beings in terms of managing the life of a parent and the life of parenting. But additionally, there is some research that suggests there are some specific benefits for parents in terms of their ability to reduce their own stress and experience a greater sense of well-being in their daily lives. With, you know, the research is not as wide and deep with parenting in relationship to mindfulness, but there is some suggestions that when parents are mindful or develop these capacities to be mindful, they're engaged in more positive parenting behaviors, and their parenting practices tend to be less negative. And they also tend to engage in more positive emotions with their children. So they're really fostering a more positive environment for their children. And that has outcomes for kids in terms of children who are in a home where a parent is exhibiting, you know, mindful awareness. Those children tend to experience less stress. They also tend to be less inclined to depression and anxiety and acting out. And with teenagers, there's some research to suggest that they're less likely to use drugs as teenagers, which is like, well, that's awesome. So there are definitely some impacts for children, and this just has to do, both in terms of the adults, the parents, and the children. This is just when a parent is practicing mindfulness. And, these incomes can be enhanced even more by a family developing the capacities to be mindful. So, think about, if there's benefit when just a parent is practicing mindfulness, how might that be increased when children are also learning the skills of mindfulness in the home? So if you've been to any of the other webinars, you know that there are particular ways that we cultivate mindfulness. One is through formal practices such as meditation, a variety of meditation styles, or mindful movement. There are also heart-based practices that we learn how to develop this capacity to be more accepting and open. A popular one is referred to as loving kindness. But in the realm of parenting, I think the thing that parents can really find more access to, just because of the kind of chaotic nature of parenting, I think parents can benefit more from informal, or be able to access more informal practices, which is really bringing mindfulness into daily activities. So, bringing awareness to anything that we're doing in our daily lives as parents, whether that's, washing the dishes, or, taking the kids to school, or whatever it is we do. There's opportunities throughout our days to informally practice mindfulness through our daily activities, or to take short pauses throughout the day to just check in with ourselves and make sure that we're doing okay, that we're attending to ourselves, and bringing awareness to how we're feeling in any present moment. So I do feel like the informal practices are, especially the younger our kids are, it seems to me from my own experience of being a parent, that at least the informal practices are something we can tap into if we struggle to find the time for formal practices. So there's really kind of three ways that I orient towards teaching mindfulness, because one is about our relationship with ourselves, which I refer to as befriending ourselves. And there's also the area of building connection with our kids, and then cultivating well-being in our children. So as I'm going through this, I'm going to kind of target these three main areas: befriending ourselves, building connection, and cultivating well-being in our children, and ways that we can orient towards that. So let's first talk about this idea of befriending ourselves. And this has to do with our capacity to regulate, so self-regulate, to manage our own feelings, our own autonomic nervous system, to be able to manage our own levels of arousal, and to keep ourselves in a space that feels where we may be experiencing challenge, but we're not overwhelmed by it. So that's one of the things that mindfulness can help us do. It can also help us with our own self-care. It can help us in terms of developing some compassion for this, what I think can be a really challenging process of raising children. And then it can also help us to develop insight. So really understanding ourselves better and knowing ourselves better, having a sense of our own habits and conditioning, and noticing how that's informing our lives, both as individuals, but also in relationship to how we're parenting. So let's first talk about this idea of stress, because I think this is a critical piece that many parents struggle with. So every 2 years, the American Psychological Association develops a Stress in America survey. And back in 2015, so they basically, on a national scale, they do this large scale study on stress, and collect data from all over the United States, and then report on their findings. And in 2015, their report found some specific kind of consistent responses from parents that they actually took the time in their report to kind of point towards. And what they found was, or what they reported on, was that parents were more likely to have experienced symptoms of stress. So parents were reporting that they were aware that they were experiencing a great deal of stress. They were also able to communicate that their stress was having an impact on their health, both physically and mentally. And what this finding suggests, is that the stress is chronic, right? Chronic stress is what typically will lead to negative physical and mental health. So there's this idea that the stress that parents are experiencing are long-term. You know, I kind of look at parenting as a marathon. You know, it's not a sprint, and we really have to orient towards this process of raising children as a marathon, and taking care of ourselves accordingly, because otherwise we do end up with these kind of outcomes of negative impacts on our body and mind. These parents were also more likely to engage in unhealthy stress management techniques, which doesn't surprise me at all, because people who chronically deal with stress often lean into maladaptive coping mechanisms. So this could be things like, you know, smoking or drinking alcohol, or, you know, taking pharmaceuticals, or any ways that we kind of numb ourselves out when we're feeling overwhelmed. Parents were reporting that they were recognizing these qualities in themselves in their role as parents. They mentioned also a lack of patience with their children due to stress, and they knew they weren't doing enough to manage stress. So when we think about mindful parenting and the benefits of mindfulness, it's pretty obvious, I think it's pretty apparent, that managing our stress is probably one of the most important things we can do to care for ourselves. And mindfulness will give us this capacity. And how it does this is, you know, through this development of awareness, we can start to move away from our habits and our reactivity and actually move into more thoughtful responses. So there's actually the opportunity to have a pause before we move into behaviors. And this can be really important in the parenting process. It doesn't mean we're always going to respond the way we would wish to, you know. I'm just thinking of my own life, and in this past week had an incident with one of my children where I had to react really quickly, and my response was not really good, and it ended up making a bad situation worse. So it's not like we learn the skills of mindfulness and our reactivity goes away, but it does help us to slow down long enough many times so that we can be more responsive than reactive. And as you, I'm sure, are aware as parents, that's a really important skill to have. So let's talk about this idea of self-regulation and self-care. You know, as I mentioned, self-regulation is really about being able to manage ourselves when we're feeling hyper-aroused. Our ability to self-regulate is our ability to self-soothe, to manage thoughts or feelings, and also to manage our behaviors. And mindfulness can help us develop this capacity through that pause. You know, we can use that pause to really feel into our experience and do things that can be helpful in terms of taking care of ourselves in the moment when intensity is happening. You know, doing things to help calm down our nervous system, helping us to hold back from behaviors that we may later regret. So it gives us that chance to self-regulate ourselves and manage ourselves. The additional piece that mindfulness helps us with is this idea of self-care, because one of the things that we're developing through this awareness is noticing what's happening in our bodies. So noticing things like being stressed, being able to physiologically feel stress in the body before we're moving into behaviors. You may notice that there is at least I notice for myself, the more stressed out I am, the shorter my temper is, the more likely I am to respond in a way that isn't skillful. There are certain things that show up when I'm stressed in terms of my own behaviors. And oftentimes when I'm noticing stress, or I'm noticing what I like to refer to as kind of monster mommy, when I start losing my temper with my kids, or being really short with them, or getting to the point where they're grating on my nerves, usually that for me has become an indicator that I need to take care of myself. Because the reality is, if we're not filling our cup ourselves and we're just constantly giving our energy away, we will burn out. It is really important as parents that we are taking time to fill our own cups. And what mindfulness can help us do is help us to recognize when we're getting close to empty, or when we're on empty, so we can be proactive in taking care of ourselves. And that's a critical piece of the parenting puzzle in terms of making sure that we are well and happy, and that we are managing our stress. Okay, so mindfulness can help us through the embodiment of mindfulness, this awareness that we're building in our and understanding our stress levels in our body, like how stress is showing up in our bodies and how we're responding. Mindfulness can help us to recognize these things and then take actions to care for ourselves. The other piece of this is this idea of self-compassion. And self-compassion is basically providing compassion to ourselves. It's this recognition of suffering that may occur, when we're feeling like we're not doing it right, or we're not feeling adequate as parents, or perhaps we did something that we're not feeling good about in terms of a personal failure, that we can meet those moments with some compassion towards ourselves. And for our time together tonight, I thought I would kind of walk us through a self-compassion practice. It's called the self-compassion break, that we could all just take a few minutes to practice together and see how it feels, how it resonates for you, to offer yourself some compassion. So how we'll do this is, I'm going to ask you, if you're sitting in a chair, to get yourself in a comfortable seated position. And I'm going to encourage you, if you're comfortable to do so, to close down your eyes. And we're going to sit with a sense of awakeness. So I would like you to potentially have your feet solid on the floor, if you're comfortable doing that and if you're able to. And sitting with some lift in the spine. So there's this idea of some uplift in the spine as you sit. And your hands can just be resting on your thighs or on the arms of a chair, whatever is available to you. So just shutting down your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And I'd just like you to take a moment to reflect on an area in your life where you may be experiencing some challenge. And this can be a specific situation, a general challenge that you're experiencing in your life, something that's not too overwhelming. Something on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being overwhelming. We want to be on a 5, something that's about a 5 or 6 for you in your life. So bringing to mind this area, and it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to your parenting or your children, but just trying to bring awareness to an area in your life where you're feeling some stress or some suffering, where you might be having a hard time. And as you gather some awareness around that moment in your life, just taking a moment to notice how that feels for you in your body. Noticing where it resonates in the body in terms of the felt sensation of it. Perhaps noticing emotions that may be present for you. Or any thoughts. Not necessarily the story of what this event or moment is in your life, but just noticing how it shows up for you. And if it's helpful for you, I'd like you to take a moment to just place your hand over your heart space, feeling into the area of the heart and noticing how this part of your body is responding. And as you feel into this, just acknowledging, this is hard, just acknowledging emotions that may be present, giving them space to be there. Now this is mindfulness, this is awareness of being able to acknowledge our suffering or our pain. And just allowing ourselves to be present with that. And when you're ready, just taking a moment to acknowledge that what I'm feeling in this moment, what I'm noticing in this moment is, part of being human. Whatever this is that you're struggling with, the feelings you have about it, how you may feel about yourself or the other people in the situation. Noticing that this is just part of our common humanity, that we all struggle, we all face challenges, we all meet moments of feeling inadequate or being in pain. This is normal and natural. And it connects you, honestly, to the human family. It is part of being human. And as you notice that or acknowledge that to yourself, when you're ready, I'd like you to just offer yourself some words of kindness, some phrases of kindness, perhaps considering what you would say to a good friend in a similar situation. Perhaps words like, I'm doing the best I can. This is hard. I'm still a good person. I'm learning. I'm still growing. Whatever words that would comfort you in this moment. And perhaps considering as well, how might you meet the suffering in yourself in some behavioral way? How can you take care of yourself in a way that is nurturing and wholesome? So just acknowledging your own need for compassion and offering that to yourself. And then when you're ready, once again, just noticing yourself, your body sitting, noticing points of contact with your chair, with the floor, feeling the nourishment of your breath moving through your body. And perhaps taking a moment just to check in with the heart space, seeing if anything has shifted for you. And when you're ready, opening your eyes. Perhaps taking a moment just to orient yourself to the room that you're in. And if anybody's inclined to do so, I would welcome if anybody wanted to unmute their mic and just share what that practice felt like for you, what you noticed, including what might have been challenging about it.
Anybody? Well, Amy, I'll state for myself, this is my,
Mm-hmm.
as I think and ponder as being a parent, and your self-compassion exercise, wherein you say, all right, hey, I'm doing the best that I can. I always grapple with wanting to be better and not make excuses like, man, I can do better, and not settling for inadequacies or whatever, while at the same time, not beating myself up about it, to where, you're saying, oh, you're not a failure, or you're not, oh, you're just a bad dad or a bad parent or whatever. I think the exercise is useful in that you realize, oops, I made a misstep, or to use your word, and I like it, I wasn't as skillful as I could have been, but
Yeah.
hey, I'm going to endeavor to be better, step in between stimulus and response with mindfulness, next time, and realize, all right, hey, I need to be more skillful in my interactions. Those are my takes.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, absolutely. Everyone else? Anything?
Okay, well, I'm not gonna force the conversation, but I do hope that you found that practice helpful. It's a real simple tool that we can take into our daily lives in those moments that we notice when we're struggling, to just acknowledge what's happening for ourselves and to remember that what we're struggling with is, part of a larger human struggling, and that we can tend to ourselves in those moments of struggle, that we don't need to berate or belittle ourselves. Mike spoke to something I think is really important about, our culture can get really caught up in what we refer to as the tyranny of self-improvement, that self-improvement can become like a whipping boy in our daily lives if we allow it. And I like to think as human beings that, we're here to learn and grow, and we're not meant to be perfect, because none of us are. And when we hold unreasonably high expectations on ourselves, hold ourselves to those expectations, it can in and of itself create suffering. So if we can orient more towards this idea of I'm growing and I'm learning, and allow ourselves this humanness that all of us share in, this imperfection. There's in the Japanese culture, there's an aesthetic called wabi-sabi. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but it's this idea of the beauty that is present in imperfection. And like, for example, in Japanese ceramics, if like a bowl gets a crack, a wabi-sabi approach to that is to fill the crack with gold, so that it's still functional and it can still be beautiful even with its cracked or its crack. And we can attend to our lives in the same way, to recognize, and I have found this true in my own life, that the mistakes, so-called in quotes, the mistakes that we make can serve us. And quite frankly, they can serve humanity, because a well-lived life is a messy life, and if we can pay attention, which is what mindfulness is teaching us how to do, we can do things to change how we're responding to what's happening, and we can grow as a result. But you can't grow if you're not paying attention. You can't recognize where change needs to occur, as well as in the realm of parenting. Sometimes we just don't even know, right? We're not given a manual on how to parent, and there's tons of opinions about how to best parent our children, but it's not a linear process. So we really have to work in a space of creativity and uncertainty, and trying things out and learning as we go, because these kids are not cookie cutters. They don't come out of a mold that's the same for each one of them. It's a dynamic experience, parenting. But I digress. I will move forward from here. So this kind of last piece of our relationship with ourselves has to do with this idea of lineage. You know, we all come out of ancestral lines that are connected to our family ties that go back, you know, millennia. You know, who we are today is the result of a path of the people who span time behind us, and as well the children who will, you know, come from us. So we sit in a unique point in time in relationship to our lineage. And I think it's important as parents that we recognize what we've come out of. So the lineages that we come out of, the belief systems that we've come out of, the kind of family histories that we've come out of, that we incorporate some knowing or understanding of what we have inherited, and having some awareness around what we want to keep and what we want to change. Like, we have the power to do that as parents, to look at our family histories, look at the things that we're proud of and want to carry forward, but also to look at how we might want to do things differently, how we might want to change the future, and that we have in this moment as parents the potential to do that, right? That we can change the narrative, we can change ways of doing and being and relating to our children. And we can play an active role in kind of shifting things that have been normalized in our family systems if we choose to. You know, we have this opportunity in this moment, but we have to be able to kind of look at, you know, what is the conditioning I've inherited? What are the belief systems I've inherited? You know, we have to be able to bring awareness and attention to those things if we want to change them. And the other piece of this, though, is that we may recognize through that process of, you know, inquiry into our own histories, family histories, that we don't have the skill sets that we might need. When I consider my own family dynamics, you know, there are definitely some things that I wanted to carry forward from my family, but there were also some things I really wanted to change. And I'll just give one example. In my family of origin, we didn't know how to talk about feelings. You know, there was no language for feelings. There were certain feelings that were okay, but most of them weren't, especially the challenging ones. And so there were a lot of places where there was just a real lack of communication. There was a real lack of being able to manage conflict and deal with challenges within the family system, because nobody knew how to talk about what was going on. And one thing I learned really early in parenting my own children is that I really lacked some communication skills. And I tended to be a more kind of authoritarian as a parent. You know, it's all about me getting my way and kind of controlling my kids versus, you know, really developing a collaborative relationship with them. So one of the things I realized is, wow, I have to develop the skill of communication, because it's just something I never got in my own childhood. So sometimes, you know, this endeavoring to understand our histories will bring awareness to us that we have things that we need to learn, and we may not know things that we need to endeavor to understand better as well. So that's kind of the piece that has to do with befriending ourselves. So now I want to move into this idea of building connection. So this is about building our relationship with our children, because as I said, you know, this will be one of the most important relationships in their lives. And if we attend to it, it can also be one of the more important relationships in our own. Now, mindful parenting, one of the kind of principles that it rests upon is what we refer to as attachment theory. And attachment theory comes out of developmental research that was occurring in the 1950s. And what they were looking at is, how does the early childhood relationship with a primary caretaker influence the child throughout their lives? And the reality is that You know, our early childhood relationships will establish our mental models that will carry us through the rest of our lifetime. It's this critical interpersonal relationship that a child has with a primary caretaker that will likely inform how they see themselves, how they see the world, how they see their ability to impact the world and respond to it. A lot of it will be learned through this early relationship. And what they found is children who developed a healthy attachment with their primary caretaker, there were kind of four qualities to the parental orientation in that relationship. The parent was able to attune to the child, so the parent was really able to empathize with whatever was happening with their child. They were able to really connect emotionally and get it on the level of their child. They were able to respond to whatever their children's needs were, and they were effective in their response. And then finally, they were able to do these things consistently in their relationship. And when they were able to do that, a child was able to develop a secure attachment to their primary caretaker. And the beauty of a secure attachment is it has meaningful outcomes for children over their lifespan. So outcomes of secure attachment include things like trust, having a positive self-image, being self-directed, having a kind of an optimistic outlook. Children with secure attachments tend to have stronger, healthier relationships. They're more resilient and adaptable, and they show better emotional control. And when I look at that list, I think that's exactly what I want for my children. And then that just reinforces the importance of this parent-child relationship, that we do what we can to develop a secure attachment with our kids. And there's really 5 elements that foster a secure attachment. One has to do with this idea of collaboration, that in dyad, so in the parent-child dyad, there's a sense of attuned communication, you know, that the back and forth of communication, the parent and child are attuned to one another, and each person in that relationship feels felt, you know, like they feel seen and heard within the relationship. Reflective dialogue is another piece of secure attachment, and that once again has to do with not only attunement, but also developing emotional intelligence. So that within the parent-child relationship, that emotions are seen as important, and there's dialogue that fosters communication about feelings. Additionally, when there is conflict within the relationship, there is efforts to make repair any ruptures. So rather than people, you know, a child and a parent having you know, a squabble or you know, some kind of eruption happening, that there is the circling back to actually repair and resolve whatever that issue is, rather than just kind of leaving things hanging. In these relationships, there tends to be like a coherent narrative. So there's this idea that we kind of work together to make our storylines coherent in terms of having a sense of past, present, and future, and co-constructing stories about what's happening in our life events. So that's really parent and child collaborating in terms of building meaning and understanding within their communications. And then finally, that there's space for emotion, you know, that there's room to talk about feelings and recognize that having feelings is part of being human, and that that's valued within the relationship. So one thing we can do us, and we do this in 3 ways: through our presence, you know, really being present in our dialogues with our kids and really being attuned to what's happening for them, and also being aware of what's happening for us, you know, being able to notice how we're responding when we're in communication with our children. And one of probably the most meaningful things we can do for our kids is learning how to just listen. There are so many times when we are engaging with our kids only when we are trying to direct and change their behaviors. I remember this story I read many years ago where this father was talking about he had a son that was like 3 years old, and he was starting to exhibit signs of anxiety, and he was actually really avoidant of his relationship with his dad. He had gone from really enjoying his time with his father to not really wanting to be around him. And as the father really started to pay attention to how these engagements with his son went, he started to recognize that the only time that he was engaging with his child was when he was correcting his behavior. So this child was not receiving any kind of input from his dad saying, you know, how he was doing things right, how he was a good kid, how he was, you know, kind of the apple of his daddy's eye. He was not getting any of that messaging. The only messaging he was getting from his dad was criticism. And as a result, he was developing anxiety when he was in his dad's presence. And I think that many times as parents, we can get caught up in this role of, you know, once again, trying to mold our children into being the human beings that we want them to be, rather than just really appreciating what they bring to the table, you know. I have found as I've learned how to listen to my kids that they have really amazing, wonderful insights to share if I can take the time to really listen. I mean, they teach me in many ways. I am always surprised by the ideas that my children have and the insights that they have, and even their interpretations of things they point me to things that I would have never seen on my own. But the only reason those things have come to light for me is because I'm really actively learning how to listen to them and listen deeply, not just to hear the things I want to hear, but being open to hearing, you know, whatever is true for them, you know. And then finally, this idea of right speech, you know, oftentimes we're not really thoughtful when we are in the role of communicating. So right speech has to do with, you know, really gauging what we say before we say it. So it's about, you know, is what we're sharing true and authentic for us? You know, are we being authentic when we're communicating with our kids? Are we being kind? Even if we're offering discipline, even if we're trying to correct behavior, we can do that in a way that's kind and sincere. You know, is what we're saying beneficial? You know, is it helpful? Is it really going to be helpful for our child to share what we have to share? And is it necessary? You know, is it necessary for the sake of building understanding? And finally, is the timing right? You know, are we saying what we need to say when we need to say it? I had an experience once of listening to this parent just berate their child in a public space. And I just remember seeing that child's feeling, you know, you could just see kind of the anguish of the embarrassment that that child was experiencing in that moment. And, you know, and quite frankly, it wasn't that the parent didn't need to say anything, but perhaps it needed to be said at a different moment when the child could really hear what they had to say. And then it wasn't so emotionally excruciating for their child to hear it, you know. So timing is a really critical piece when we think about when we communicate with our children. So this final piece, this nurturing well-being, nurturing the well-being of our children. And this has to do with, you know, understanding our children developmentally, where they're at developmentally, and how we can develop strategies to support them in their development. I love this quote by Dan Siegel that, you know, too often we forget that discipline means to teach, not to punish. I think so many of us come into parenting with a real authoritarian model of parenting, and mindful parenting isn't that. It's really moving us away from that and really looking at things as more of a collaboration, you know, that we're trying to collaborate with our children. And once again, using that analogy of the garden, you know, we're trying to create the best conditions for this child to learn and develop and grow in. So when we do need to course correct, when we do need to offer some guidance, looking at ourselves as coaches, we're coaching our children. We're really more in the other thing is that parenting is more of it's a leadership role. So, part of our role as parents is learning how to be good leaders for our families. So Dan Siegel talks about this idea of the river of well-being. And if you've been on any of the other webinars that we've had thus far with Warriors Ascent, I've talked several times about this idea of the window of tolerance. And this river of well-being is kind of the parent's guide to helping your children regulate their nervous system. So when we think about our children being on this river of well-being, when they're in the middle of the river, they're in a state in terms of their autonomic nervous system, they're in a state of feeling balanced and alert, they're engaged in what they're doing. There's a sense of having a sense of peace and, really being in the moment in a way that feels healthy and wholesome. But when they move to the banks of this river of well-being is when we can run into problems. And you can think of the banks of the river of well-being having to do with the arousal of the nervous system. So when the nervous system moves into a state of overactivity, so being hyper aroused, they'll move into a space of chaos. That's when they get emotionally dysregulated. They can kind of lose control of their ability to manage their feelings. And when they get to the banks of rigidity, when there's not enough energy in their nervous system, that can look like when children kind of put their, when the stubbornness shows up, when they're not willing to do what they need to do or what they're being asked to do, that's when they kind of put their feet in the mud. That can look like the rigidity, the bank of rigidity. And so when our children are on these banks of this river of well-being, there are strategies that we can employ as parents to support getting them back into this river of well-being. And a lot of it has to do with understanding how their brains work. Many of us don't come into parenting having an understanding of the neurological development of children. But human children have one of the longest developmental periods of any of the mammals in the animal kingdom. And especially when we think about the brains of children. The executive functions of the brain, so the prefrontal cortex, the kind of higher level thinking of the brain, is not fully matured in a child until they're in their early 20s. So there's oftentimes when we're looking at children's behavior and seeing certain behaviors as problematic, if we understood it in relationship to the development of their brain, oftentimes what they're doing is developmentally appropriate. The reason kids often cannot emotionally hold it together is because they don't have the neurological development yet to be able to do it. And so what we can do as parents is learn, one, how to help them get themselves back into that river of well-being through strategies that we can employ as we understand their brains, but also by maintaining our own ability to regulate ourselves, we can help our children regulate themselves. So we're giving them, through our calm, through our ability to stay regulated, we can help our children what they refer to as co-regulate. But when we talk about neuroplasticity of the brain, the fact that the brain is always shifting and changing in relationship to experience, you could think about it as, as parents, that we can play a really critical role kind of as the architects of our children's brains through the experiences that we provide them. Because through experience, the structures of their brain are developed, which then influences the function of the brain, which ultimately influences their perceptions of what's happening. So if we can start to develop some understanding around their neurological development and influence the experience that they're having, we can play a significant role in how their brains function and operate from moment to moment. So let's talk a little bit about this is just kind of baseline information on the human brain. And we refer to the brain as a triune brain, meaning there's kind of three primary portions to the brain. There's the neurocortex, which is the upper area, the area in the blue in this picture, and that's like the newest area of the brain. That's really what separates us from the animal kingdom. This is where executive function operates, our ability to self-regulate, to make judgments and decisions, to plan, and it's where kind of our understanding of emotion, our ability to understand emotion in other people, kind of the social function of the brain, exists in this neocortex. And then in the middle of the brain is what's referred to as the midbrain. And this is kind of the emotional center of the brain. This is where the limbic system is, which houses the amygdala, which is where the fight and flight center is of the brain. And it's where we hold feelings and memories. And then in the lower portion of the brain, the area in brown, that's the reptilian brain. And that's the oldest area of the brain. It's the part of the brain that kind of manages the automatic functions of our brain, our regulatory system. Okay? So when we're talking about engaging with our kids, especially when they're dysregulated, so especially when they're in a state of heightened emotional reactivity, when they're not able to self-regulate, we really need to orient towards engaging them in a way that speaks to these different areas of their brain, okay? So we do this by starting from the reptilian brain. You know, we're starting by engaging with the sensory experience that they're having, recognizing, being able to feel into the bodily experience that they're having. And then we can tap into the feeling state. So that's when we can move into naming what's happening. And we do all of these two things before we start problem solving. Unfortunately, as parents, we often tend to move right into problem solving when our children are dysregulated and they're just not in a place when they've, you know, kind of lost their emotional control. They're just not in a place to problem solve. So really what we want to be able to do is to first engage them on a sensory level, you know, to try to get their nervous system calmed down. And then we can talk to them about what they were feeling. You know, once they're calmed back down, we can talk about whatever feelings were present, what was happening for them, you know, what perhaps if there were behavior issues, like if a behavior problem was showing up as a result of their emotionality, talking about, you know, what problem behaviors were present. And then finally, problem solving from that place, that once we have these other kind of areas attended to, then we can move towards problem solving. Now, this does mean that it's a longer process in terms of helping our children self-regulate and strategizing problem solving, but it's also working with their brains in the way that their brains are operating when they're dysregulated. So we're really attending to their brains in a way that will help them calm down, then be able to attend to the emotions that are present for them, and then move into problem solving, especially if we're having to provide redirection in terms of their behaviors, how they'll move forward in the future. So we're giving them the opportunity to grow and learn. But when we try to direct problem solving, when they're dysregulated, it's a losing battle because they're not in a place to ever hear what we have to say. So that is kind of it for me. If you were to take nothing away from this other than, you know, as I mentioned early on, our own ability to develop the skills of mindfulness, you know, our own ability to self-regulate, take care of ourselves, show ourselves compassion, and to be inquisitive about like our own conditioning. If we were to only use mindfulness to do those things for ourselves, that alone can have a significant impact on our family in terms of the levels of stress within the home, our children's ability to manage their own stress. Because in many ways, we're modeling to our children always through our behavior. So it really does start with us. As much as we want to help our children learn the skills of mindfulness, as much as we might want to help them in developing those skills, the most critical piece is developing these skills for ourselves, because it will have a ripple effect throughout the family. And finally, and this, like I said, this will be in the handout that you receive. I just provided you with a few books if you want to continue this exploration of mindful parenting, and also some communication. These are some books that you might want to consider taking a look at to continue your journey with mindfulness. So that's all I've got. I'm going to turn my camera back on. If there are any questions, I am happy to offer any insights that I might share.
Amy, I've got a question regarding the sensory experience, you know, how you first attack it. What are some examples of that?
So that would be like, notice, where do you notice? Okay, so say your child is, you know, has had is upset about something. Not in the state when they're really hyper aroused, but when they're starting to calm down, asking them to tell you where they feel whatever it is they're feeling in their body. What do you notice in your body right now? You know, you're trying to, it's gonna do two things. One is it's going to help them start to develop some awareness for themselves in terms of, you know, what does this feel like in my body when I'm upset? So you're giving them an opportunity to develop some personal insight into what it feels like when they're upset, but then also giving the opportunity for them to name it. Because that's the second. So you get like, where do you feel whatever you're feeling in your body? What is the sensation? You know, like, do you feel tension in your muscles? Do you feel tight? Do you feel heat? You know, what is the sensory experience that they're having? Like, what's the felt experience? And from that, then you can go into helping your child to name that emotion. Like, what is that feeling tied to as an emotion? So you're really developing some self-awareness for them, as well as emotional intelligence. Okay, but we first need them to start de-escalating, right? And part of what feeling into their experience can do is bring them into the moment. So it's one of the things that they can learn how to do to bring themselves back. But you don't want to do it when your kid's like completely lost and pitching a fit. It's as they're starting to de-escalate. It's starting to be curious and to just be genuinely curious. Like when you inquire for yourself, like, what does anger feel like in my body? Where do I notice that? You know, and that's why having our own practice can be so helpful, because then we can guide our children in that self-inquiry as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So when they're in that hyperarousal stage, is it just a waiting game?
It can be. It can be just presence. Like what I have found really works, and it just takes longer. This is the rub, you know, to allow our children to cycle down. I mean, we can be offering words of encouragement, like, I'm here for you, you know, I love you, I'm here for you, I can see this is hard for you, you know, but giving them the space to start cycling down. And quite frankly, this works on adults too. Like, this is the beauty of learning these things. Everything you learn in parenting that works, it usually works on adults as well. So, but it's allowing them the chance to cycle down, and it's really just about inviting the space without problem solving right away. Like, that problem solving is the last thing we do, and we do it when we're calm and they're calm, because then you're collaborating. Then you're able to collaborate, and your child can have some say, can be able to communicate with you, like, this was what I was having a problem with. And if you can give your kid the chance to do that, sometimes you'll get insights from them that you weren't even aware of. Like, oh God, I didn't even know that was happening for you. I didn't realize you saw it that way. Did that answer your question? I'm happy to keep going
Yes.
with it.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. And I will just share a personal experience. So this past week, I think it was Monday or something, my son and my cat were outside with me while I was on the phone with somebody, and my cat picked up a baby bunny and started to run away with it. And my son was really excited, and I don't think my son understood. He's 8, almost 8, and I freaked out because my cat was getting ready to tear up a baby bunny, and I couldn't just sit on the phone and watch that. And I said, "What are you doing? Why are you letting her do that?" And my son was absolutely crushed that, 1, because he didn't realize it was a baby bunny, and 2, that I had brought to his awareness that my cat was getting ready to rip up a baby bunny. And it just created this huge cascade. And I had to spend 2 hours talking my son down off that because he felt horrible, and he felt so much shame, and he didn't know how to deal with it. He didn't know how to name it. And it was a really long process. And we even talked about it the next day. Like it takes longer. But your children are learning critical skills when you do that with them. When you take the time, and you can't always take the time, because there are times when you just need stuff to happen for the sake of safety or whatever. But when you can take the time to really sit on the ledge with your child and let them talk themselves down and do the work of helping them name the feelings, talk about how it feels in the body, and problem solve together, you're giving them just really incredible life skills that can serve them, not just in that moment, but moving forward, not only for themselves, but in terms of how they relate to other people. Like, oh, my dad gave me this space, so I can give this space to somebody else. Does that make sense? It's more work. I'll just say, honestly, it's more work. And it's hard, but
Yeah, but it gives you
you're
hope.
growing and learning as well. And quite frankly, you're becoming a better human being by doing that with somebody. Because if you do it with your child, you can do it with a friend, you can do it with a family member. Like, these are life skills. Any other questions? Thank you for that question. Thank you. Any other questions?
I was just going to say there's another good book. Not that I'm the expert, and I certainly don't have
I'm
your
not
background,
either.
but Daniel Goleman. It's a book called Emotional Intelligence. What he describes is amygdala hijacking.
Mm-hmm.
Once someone's in that state, there's no rationalizing with them. I've made that mistake with adults and my kids. And you're like, no, I'm talking logic to you. They don't want to hear logic. And Matt, just like you were saying, even with my youngest, once he gets all worked up, I'm just like, it's time to disengage. So hey, take a couple minutes, go upstairs, just relax. When you've calmed down, then we're going to do your homework. But up to that point, he doesn't want to hear about, no, you need to do your homework because there's certain skills. You know, it's that amygdala hijacking that just once they get there, there's just no, all right, hey, listen, I'm going to tell you, you know, you're just, all right, you need to.
Yeah.
And that's when, as Amy says, that's when you appear and say, do you understand now why? Say, yeah, I get it. All right, can we do homework now? Okay. You know,
Yeah.
so. And like you said, it's time. When you're like, I need to get out the door. You need to put your shoe on. I'm not putting my shoe. Oh, yes, you are. You may not realize it, but you are.
Yeah.
Versus, hey, I got all day, man. You know, so
Right.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
That's right. And so I think it's really important to, when you do have those moments, to take those moments, right? When you do have the time, to take the time, because you're building a relationship with that child as you do that. I mean, because conflict, as you know, is part of being human. It's part of developing a team. It's part of collaboration. It's part of building connection. Conflict is natural, right? It's a natural thing. And if we don't have conflict, somebody ain't being authentic, right?
See, I like what you said about circling back, though. You know, coming
Mhm.
back and saying, all right, it got heated. Do you understand now why it is that I can't let you do this? It's not safe. You know,
Mhm.
and repairing whatever rift. I think that's important. That was a really good point, you know, major takeaway from you.
Right. Because if we can't, and sometimes that coming back is saying, I'm sorry, I kind of didn't do that right, you know? Because if we can't apologize to our kids, are they going to learn how to apologize to people? Are they going to be able, if we expect pristine behavior out of them, will they ever be able to acknowledge when they move outside of that? You know? If they never see us do it, will they ever do it themselves? And how does it feel when somebody never says sorry?
You know, the modeling good behavior that you spoke of, you know, so
Leadership, my friend.
modeling an example. You know.
Yeah.
Amy, thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry we went over, but I thank
Ah,
everyone for being here.
It was definitely worth it. All right, everybody. Hey, thanks so much. We have one more, I think, next week. Yes?
Yeah, the heart of mindfulness.
That's right. Yep. And then, hey, so, you know, join us next week. Hope you got something out of it. I know I did. I always do whenever I listen to Amy, you know, but no, thanks so much, everybody, for showing up. Amy, of course, thanks so much to you. And we'll
My
see you all
pleasure.
next week. Have a great weekend. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.